as one of the top speechwriters during the George W. Bush administration and was also chief speechwriter to Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. His book, Speechless: Tales of a White House Survivor, is a New York Times bestseller in which he chronicles his career in Washington and gives readers a rare, behind-the-scenes and somewhat controversial view inside the Bush White House in its final days. Joining us on Newsmax TV is author Matt Latimer. Matt, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
You write, in effect, that you were let down by some of the jobs that you had in Washington, basically because you were disappointed in the leaders for whom you worked. You say that though you respected Secretary Rumsfeld, the Defense Department was alarmingly dysfunctional, and that in the Bush White House, staffers who were running the country were in way over their heads.
Well, sure. I mean, there were a lot of people who worked hard and tried to accomplish something as well, but one of the things I found at the end of the administration, it happens in a lot of administrations, you're sort of left with people who are kind of the last of the loyalists to the president as opposed to necessarily to the conservative movement. And we had a lot of people who were trying hard, were nice people, but sort of were kind of out of their depth in a lot of ways. Like one example is they wanted, for a speech, they wanted President Bush to go to Monticello and declare himself the heir to Thomas Jefferson, which wasn't necessarily probably the smartest move to do at the time when the president unfortunately had an approval rating in the 30s.
In the book, you write that almost everything the public has been told about major players, Bush, Cheney, Rice, Rumsfeld, Rove, is wrong. What did you mean by that?
Well, the conventional wisdom, as typically happens with a lot of Republican administrations, is usually wrong. You know, every Republican president in my lifetime has been an idiot or a dunce, and President Bush was not dumb. He was smart, he was funny, he was quick. He liked to be very decisive, but I wasn't always comfortable with all the decisions that were made, but that's probably true with every president. Condi Rice tended to escape a lot of criticism for her role in a lot of administration decisions because she was very good at dealing with the press, which Vice President Cheney and Secretary Rumsfeld were not as worried or interested in trying to cultivate the press, and they ended up getting bad press as a result a lot of times. Karl Rove I found to be something of a disappointment. He was supposed to be the architect of the grand realignment for the Republican Party, and we can see now where the Republican Party is. We have President Obama and Speaker Pelosi that speaks against that.
Matt, how much did President Bush believe in a conservative movement? On page 250, you relay a conversation in which he tells you that there is no conservative movement.
Yeah, President Bush had run for president, as you know, as a compassionate conservative, which was sort of a way of redefining what conservatism is. You know, a lot of conservatives like me sort of thought that was a gimmick to kind of appeal to people, but it turns out it was actually what he meant. And what he believed in was kind of a larger government and more spending, as we see the record. And I had a conversation with him, as I relate in my book, about the conservative movement, and he told me, you know, he defeated Gary Bauer in 2000 badly. Gary Bauer apparently was the epitome of the conservative movement for him, and he said that conservative movement stuff is over. I redefined the Republican Party, and I wasn't necessarily sure I wanted to redefine the Republican Party away from Reaganite principles.
Did the president dislike conservatives?
I don't think he disliked conservatives, but I think he was suspicious of a lot of conservatives. I remember he mentioned the treatment that his father, former President Bush, received from conservatives, and that seemed to stick with him.
In comparison to his predecessors, President Bush was the largest social spender in U.S. history. Research we at Newsmax have conducted shows that the president spent at an even faster rate than any president before him. He also brought a Wilsonian approach to foreign policy. Wilson, we know, was a Democrat. What's your opinion? At the end of the day, was he a conservative or not?
I don't think he was a traditional conservative, no. I mean, early on in the administration, he did govern on a lot of conservative ideals of lower taxes. You know, he obviously put two conservatives on the Supreme Court. But overall, you know, his fiscal record, his spending record was not conservative. He spent a lot of money. He abandoned a lot of free market principles during the economic recovery. And towards the end on foreign policy even, he, you know, was more towards negotiating with Iran and changing his position on a timeline for withdrawal from Iraq. And he also changed his position on climate change, as I relate in the book, in favor of a cap-and-trade policy.
What were President Bush's opinions of the neoconservatives on foreign policy? And do you believe that his opinion changed with time?
I do believe his opinion changed. After the 2006 election, when we lost the House and the Senate, he seemed to sort of lose faith in conservatives and the principles that he'd sort of been articulating for most of his administration, and moved towards what I called the cleaners. And these are people who are sort of pragmatists, like, you know, Josh Bolten, the Chief of Staff, and Bob Gates, the Secretary of Defense. and Condi Rice. And these are people who wanted to shift towards, what they called so-called pragmatism in foreign policy, which tended to appeal to the New York Times and the establishment foreign policy world. And that was more towards negotiating with Iran and having a deal with North Korea, which I thought was unwise, and other things like that.
You were inside the White House from March of 2007 to September of 2008 and witnessed the final days of Bush's presidency. What was the reaction inside the White House when it learned that the economy was about to collapse and when the Republican majority of Congress was defeated?
Well, when the economy collapsed, it was obviously a very chaotic and frightening atmosphere. I was one of the few people in the world, as I talk about in my book, who knew ahead of time that the entire U.S. economy and capitalism as we know it could cease to exist, and we're still feeling the effects of that collapse or near collapse today. So it was a very chaotic, intense atmosphere, and it seemed to me that Secretary Paulson, a man of Wall Street, was really calling a lot of the shots in the administration at that point, to the point in which President Bush even expressed frustration that Paulson wasn't telling him everything that was going on. And after the election, I think President Bush was deeply disappointed by the election results, as a lot of Republicans were, losing the House and the Senate. And I think that affected the administration and moved it more toward the center and the left, whereas I would have preferred it to stay more to the right.
What kind of person is President Bush? You got to know him pretty well.
President Bush is a smart person. He is funny. He likes to make decisions. He's a decisive person. He wasn't particularly concerned all the time with the effects of the decisions he was making in terms of the conservative movement. He wasn't, as I say, a traditional conservative. But he was an interesting person and a nice person to talk to. He could be quite compassionate and graceful. And of course, I always respect his leadership after 9/11. But on ideological grounds, I tended to find him more moderate and pragmatic than I was comfortable with.
The president had a habit of creating nicknames for people. What, if any, were the nicknames that he may have called you? And also, did he have a nickname for then candidate Barack Obama?
Well, he referred to Barack Obama at least once or twice as that cat, which was kind of an old 60s term, I guess. He didn't have a nickname for me that I know of. He might have one for me now, however, I don't know.
All right, tell us also about President Bush's and top Republicans' take on Obama and also Sarah Palin.
Well, what he said about Barack Obama, he was after Barack Obama gave that convention speech at the Democratic Convention under those Greek pillars and attacked the president and Mrs. Bush are both ticked off about it. And President Bush came into the family theater of the White House and he said, this is a dangerous world and that cat, meaning President Obama, is remotely qualified to handle it. And his attitude mellowed toward President Obama as months went on, but he was ticked off. And about Governor Palin, he called her an interesting choice, which surprised a lot of people in the White House who hoped that he'd be more enthusiastic about her. And then he warned that she and her family weren't prepared for the national media spotlight that was about to hit them. And I think that proved, unfortunately, to be the case. But I blame the McCain campaign more than I do blame the governor.
You were very close to Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. What was it like during a particularly controversial time for the secretary when he had to respond to the release of the Abu Ghraib photos?
Well, he was deeply troubled by the entire crisis. It was actually the very first major speech I wrote. I mean, I just got on the job and I barely knew Secretary Rumsfeld, and I had to write his testimony to Congress about this terrible scandal that might decide whether he kept his job and whether I kept my job. He was troubled by it, and he tried very hard to get these photographs that you would think a Secretary of Defense would be able to get quite easily. But the bureaucracy in the Pentagon, as I talk about in many instances in the book, is slow to respond even to the Secretary of Defense. And in a lot of ways, the bureaucracy which still exists really is a problematic thing in order to kind of communicate a president's goals in the war on terror and to get information that he needs to solve problems.
Matt, critics have said that you were much too candid in your account, and others have even gone so far as to call you petty. What is your response to the criticism? Well,
I don't think the American people are punished by getting candid information about their taxpayer dollars at work, and I felt an obligation to the taxpayers to tell them what I saw in an unvarnished and uncensored way. But I didn't do anything that I thought was mean-spirited. I tried to be honest. I said a lot of nice things about people who are committed public servants. One of the people that I worked for on Capitol Hill was Senator John Kyle, who's one of the people I admire more than anybody else in Washington. He's a principled conservative and a good guy. But I think the American people, and especially conservatives, need to know what happened, especially at the end of the administration, because we don't want to repeat those mistakes again.
All right, the book is Speechless, Tales of a White House Survivor, available on Amazon.com. Matt Latimer, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.
Sarah Palin's new book, Going Rogue in American Life, will be released on November 17th. You can be among the first to get your copy. Check out our incredible free offer for Sarah's new book. Just go to Newsmax.com and click on the top banner for this great offer. Act today.